Hey everybody, so a common question that's been coming up is this issue of preganglionic, post-ganglionic, neurotransmitters, receptors, what's going on? So remember what we're talking about here. We are looking at the nervous system. So here's our brain, and coming off the brain, we've got our spinal cord. And remember, we talked about the different parts of the anatomy here, and what I'm drawing here is where we might take a slice from this spinal cord. So here we're looking at a cross section. I'm just going to zoom in over here. So we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system when we're talking about preganglionic versus postganglionic, and so I'm going to draw that out. And the way that I like to draw this out is, remember, I do these lines here, and then a partial circle coming out either side. And in the middle, we've got the gray matter of the spinal cord. And there are these points, which, they kind of look like a butterfly shape, but they also look like horns in essence. And so if we had this on the posterior side, we have the posterior horns, and then on the lateral sides, we have the lateral horns. And then on the anterior, these points on the anterior side, these are the anterior horns. So the neurons that we're talking about are neurons that are from the autonomic nervous system, and these are autonomic motor neurons. And so where their cell bodies live is here in the lateral horn. And when they send out their axons, they send them out through the ventral root. And this carries motor information, right? So these would be visceral motor neurons. These are autonomic motor neurons that they're called. And this information goes out the ventral root. So this preganglionic axon is going out. And where is it going? It's going towards the ganglion. So it's passing before the ganglion. It's going towards the ganglion. This is heading out, and I'm not going to draw in all the detail here because it might take a little while, but in essence, remember what a ganglion is. A ganglion is a group of neuron cell bodies that simply lives outside the central nervous system. So we would say that it's in the peripheral nervous system. And so the axon extends out over here, and this preganglionic neuron forms a synapse with the neuron that sits inside the ganglion. And so if we drew this in, we could draw in this yellow postganglionic neuron that's sending its axon out. And this axon is going to be communicating with, going to be controlling, right, some kind of effector. And this effector for the autonomic nervous system are things that you don't have voluntary control over. So these are things like your smooth muscle, right, and your glands, and your cardiac muscle. These are involuntarily controlled tissues. Now what we're going to focus on first is the example of the sympathetic nervous system. So remember that there are two branches of the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So for the sympathetic nervous system, what's going on here? Well, this preganglionic neuron comes out from the spinal cord. It forms a synapse onto this neuron that's in the ganglion itself. Now, whenever cells want to communicate with each other, they release chemicals, and these chemicals need to bind to some sort of receptor in order for there to be an effect. And specifically, what we're talking about with the nervous system are neurotransmitters. So we're looking at neurotransmitters. These are simply chemicals that the nervous system uses to communicate between neurons or between neurons and their effectors. So remember, we saw that the axon terminal can release these neurotransmitters. Well, the neurotransmitter released by the preganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system is acetylcholine. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to zoom in even more on this little area, this little synapse between these two neurons. So I'll draw this dotted box, and let's go ahead and come down here, and I'll blow this region up so we can see more detail. So here we have this preganglionic neuron, and it's got its axon terminal coming over here. So here's preganglionic neuron, and for this specific example, we're looking at the sympathetic nervous system. So remember that these neurons have these vesicles inside of them, and these vesicles contain neurotransmitter, just like we saw with the muscle system, the skeletal muscle system. And in this case, these vesicles contain the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So when they fuse with the membrane here, just like we saw with the skeletal muscle control, they're going to release their acetylcholine into this synaptic cleft. Now, what's going to happen here? Well, we tend to simplify, and we draw the post-ganglionic neuron as this circle, as this cell body. But in reality, where are we communicating? We're communicating on dendrites. So this would be the dendrite, let's say, of this post-ganglionic neuron. So how does this acetylcholine have any sort of effect? Well, it has to bind to a receptor. In order for this signal to be communicated, there must be some kind of receptor that's able to bind to the neurotransmitter. And so in this case, inside the ganglion, where we have the postganglionic dendrite, what are we going to find there? Well, we're going to find that this dendrite has receptors, as receptors for acetylcholine. Here are these receptors. I'm going to draw them as these almost look like Lego man hands. And the acetylcholine comes in and it binds to one of these receptors. What specific type of receptors are these? Well, these are going to be nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And as we discussed in a lecture, whenever you activate these receptors, you generate an excitatory response, and we call that an EPSP. So this just means that you excite the neuron, and if you excite the neuron, you can try to get it to send an electrical impulse down the axon. So here is how the communication between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron happens within the ganglion. You get acetylcholine released, it binds to a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, and then you get some signaling that goes down the line. But what happens here on the effector side? Well, there's another synapse over here, and this synapse is, say, between, and I'm going to draw in, let's do magenta, and this will be, say, a smooth muscle cell, right? So here's my effector cell that I want to control. Well, the same kind of idea here is that if we look at this axon terminal, we're going to have to release a neurotransmitter. But in this case, the neurotransmitter is a different neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter released by the postganglionic neuron is norepinephrine. And so remember that norepinephrine, it's a neurotransmitter. The nor part kind of sounds like neuro, so this is the neurotransmitter component. Now this is a chemical, and it needs to bind to a receptor in order to signal something to happen in this other cell. So here I'm going to draw a receptor on the smooth muscle cell. And so instead of this curved receptor, let's say it looks more like field goals for football, let's say. Okay? So now this norepinephrine can come in. It will bind to these receptors and activate some kind of effect inside the cell, right? And so these receptors then, since they bind to norepinephrine, the general class of receptors is, we call them adrenergic receptors. All right, so in this case, remember that we had two general categories of adrenergic receptors. We had alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. And depending on which one you bind to, you get a different effect. If you bind to an alpha adrenergic receptor, that generally stimulates some kind of contraction of smooth muscle. If you bind to a beta adrenergic receptor, that generally causes relaxation of the smooth muscle. So that's for the sympathetic nervous system. So now let's back it up and take a look at the parasympathetic nervous system. So here I'm going to go all the way back out, and we're going to return to our spinal cord. Now remember that the neuron cell bodies for the parasympathetic nervous system either are up here in this cranial portion, or they're down here in the sacral portion of the spinal cord. So let's go ahead and draw a slice through a cross section through the sacral portion of the spinal cord, and then zoom in and see what's happening. So same kind of deal here, right? You have the spinal cord, and the spinal cord, we're going to draw it in quickly. Has this same arrangement down here. We've got the gray matter, we got the lateral horns, got the posterior horns, and then the anterior horns. So again, we've got the neuron cell body for the preganglionic parasympathetic nervous system here in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. It sends out its axon again through the ventral root. And in this case, this preganglionic neuron is very, 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 very long. And eventually, it gets to a ganglion. And so this ganglion is going to have neuron cell bodies in it. And so we can draw in one of these again. And I'm going to leave a little more space here, and we can see the general idea. So here's this post-ganglionic neuron cell body. It sends out its axon a short distance, and then there's another axon terminal. And here is that ganglion. Now, the preganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic nervous system also releases acetylcholine. It releases acetylcholine, and on the post-ganglionic neuron, it binds to receptors again, right? So these are going to be receptors, and again, we're going to see that these receptors are nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So typically, when neurons want to signal to other neurons, and they're using acetylcholine, they're going to be a lot of times using nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And so here, again, the acetylcholine will bind to the receptor, causing an excitation of the post-ganglionic neuron, which then sends out a signal towards its axon. And so from the post-ganglionic neuron, it's going to release neurotransmitter. And in this case, let's look at the example of, say, some kind of digestive gland, right? So I'll just draw this little gland out here, and there's some secretion that I want to come out. Right? So now acetylcholine is released again from the post-ganglionic neuron. So the post-ganglionic neuron of the parasympathetic nervous system. But in this case, right, we're releasing acetylcholine, but now we have a different receptor that's responding. So these cells here, let's say these are cells that are lining the gland. These are epithelial cells lining this gland. And these epithelial cells are going to express muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. So I'll draw one of those over here, and let's go ahead and make it more like a triangle, I guess. These little receptors sitting on the cell. All right, so now these are muscarinic acetylcholine receptors on the target tissues, on the target cells. So now whenever this post-ganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, it's going to bind to these receptors, and then in the case, let's say that this is a salivary gland, right? Well, it's going to stimulate the production of saliva. And so here you have your mouth watering for the meal you're about to eat. And it's right around dinner time, so that's timely, I guess. So here we have preganglionic, postganglionic, receptor types, neurotransmitter types for the parasympathetic and the sympathetic response. But we also looked at a couple different exceptions. And the exceptions were for the sympathetic nervous system. So one of these exceptions was for the effector. And so if the effector is a sweat gland, let's go ahead and zoom in on this effector side. So if the effector is a sweat gland, then the sympathetic post-ganglionic neuron will release. Let's draw another neuron cell body in here, sending it out to the sweat gland. So instead of norepinephrine, this will release acetylcholine, right? And have the same kind of effect that we talked about here, where it's going to be binding to a muscarinic receptor on the target tissue and stimulate sweat gland. Okay, so that was an example of an exception on the sympathetic nervous system side with the post-ganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine onto the sweat gland. Now let's look at another exception with the adrenal gland, and this is with the pre-ganglionic neuron. So here, just to make some more room here, I'm gonna draw out another spinal cord portion, and let's go ahead and let's do it up here. This looks like a good spot. So here's our spinal cord, and I'm going to make it real quick. I'm just going to draw this circle here. Here's our gray matter and our white matter on the outsides. So here we're looking at the preganglionic neuron. So it's going to be still again sitting here in the lateral horn, and it's going to send out its extension. So for this exception, the sympathetic nervous system is sending out the axon through the ventral root, but now the ventral root is going to the adrenal gland. And so remember that the adrenal gland, adrenal, ad means on top of, renal referring to the kidney. So let's go ahead and draw that in here. So here's my little kidney bean shaped kidney. And then on top of it, we've got this triangular shaped, pyramid shaped adrenal gland. And actually, let me just fix this neuron so it looks like it's going into the adrenal gland. So here, the axon is extending into the adrenal gland and going inside here. So now let's zoom in and look at what's going on here. So the adrenal gland for this example, this exception, is often referred to as a modified ganglion. And why do we say this? Why do we say that this is a modified ganglion? Well, in this case, if we look and we zoom in, the adrenal gland, it doesn't have the neurons, right? It doesn't have these neuron cells that are releasing substances. These are endocrine cells. They are similar to neural tissue, but they're endocrine cells. And what that means is that they release their substances into the blood. And inside the blood is where they're going to have their longer lasting effect. So here we've got this preganglionic sympathetic neuron coming inside the adrenal gland. It's releasing acetylcholine, and the acetylcholine is acting on these cells that are inside the adrenal gland. And we mentioned that these cells are called chromaffin cells. And these are the ones that are releasing, they're making mostly epinephrine. So here, epinephrine is distinct. It's chemically similar, but it's distinct to norepinephrine. So epinephrine is always considered a hormone because it is circulating inside the blood. So what do these cells do? There are blood vessels that are here. So here's, let's say, some capillary blood vessel, and these chromaffin cells, once they bind to acetylcholine, they get stimulated, and they're stimulated to release epinephrine into the blood. So they're making epinephrine, and they send it right there. Boom. So here's this molecule of epinephrine, and now it's in the blood. Now epinephrine, since it's chemically similar to norepinephrine, will have a lot of similar effects as norepinephrine, but they're going to be, longer lasting since you can maintain their levels in the blood for a longer period of time. So here's the hormonal transition. So the sympathetic nervous system, if it wants longer lasting effects, will activate the adrenal gland and cause it to release epinephrine into the blood. And there we go. We have another exception. So here, the quote-unquote post-ganglionic cells, which we would consider these chromaffin cells, but really, they're endocrine cells here. They're going to release epinephrine mostly into the bloodstream, and there's going to be some norepinephrine that's also released. Okay. So hopefully that clears things up for you guys. And this is this overview of sympathetic autonomic nervous system, the different neurotransmitters involved, the different receptors that are involved. I know it's a big mess of words. These are really weird sounding words. Sometimes you can't even pronounce them, but work through it, and you'll get it. You'll eventually get it. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.